Hello human geographers, we are back at it again this evening. Last lecture, we examined the development of our globalized economy. Tonight, we're going to examine what has changed as a result of the world economy. As transportation costs have declined, many private sector businesses across economic sectors are looking to do what Weber predicted: cut costs to maximize profits. So some businesses are using outsourcing as a way to do that. Outsourcing is the transfer of part of a firm's internal operations to a third party. So a company may eliminate its accounting department and hire an outside firm, a third party, to do that for them. This is also being done with data entry, customer service, bookkeeping, research and design, legal services, and analytics. This is done to move so-called back office jobs to other areas where land or rent might be cheaper or wages might be lower. When jobs are outsourced to another country, this is known as offshoring. Offshoring is the relocation of one or more aspect of manufacturing or support services from one country to another. For example, many countries have moved their customer service call centers to the Philippines or to India, where lower wages and a high level of English proficiency allow companies to find a cheaper way to meet the needs of customers. Many software and manufacturing companies in the United States and Europe locate their facilities in India and China to take advantage of the highly skilled but relatively lower cost labor there. A final point of clarification: outsourcing refers to the transfer of operations to a third party. That third party could be a domestic company or a foreign one. If it's in another country, that's called offshoring. So offshoring is considered outsourcing, but not all outsourcing necessarily occurs to another country. But both outsourcing and offshoring combined in the late 20th century to fuel deindustrialization of core countries. Deindustrialization is the decline, and sometimes complete disappearance of, employment in the manufacturing sector in the core's industrial centers. These jobs leave core areas and move to the global periphery where wages are lower. As a result, the deindustrialized area transitions to the tertiary sector, though many of the service jobs tend to have lower salaries and limited benefits. So let's explore deindustrialization in the United States for a moment. In the early 1970s, many manufacturing jobs began to move out of the traditional manufacturing belt of areas like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to areas in the southeast of the United States, but also to other countries. To illustrate this, in 1950, manufacturing jobs accounted for almost 1/3 of all private sector jobs in the United States. By 2020, that number was under 10%. There were many factors for this change. Infrastructure was getting out of date and taxes were high, wages were increasing, and automation could replace assembly line labor. Finally, as other countries industrialized with newer equipment and processes, older manufacturing plants weren't as profitable. So the manufacturing belt became the Rust Belt. And this phenomenon isn't exclusive to the United States. We see deindustrialization occurring in core countries around the world, as you can see in this map of deindustrialization in Europe. The major takeaway from this conversation on deindustrialization is that at the global scale, many multinational or transnational corporations have moved labor-intensive manufacturing, particularly assembly activities, from highly developed countries of the core, such as the United States, to less developed countries of the periphery and semi-periphery, such as Indonesia and Vietnam, where labor is cheap, regulations are few, and tax rates are low. This leads to a shift from an industrial economy based on manufacturing to a post-industrial economy based on the service sector. And there is a period of high unemployment as communities transition from the secondary to tertiary sectors. During this time, old factories are left vacant, as with this automobile plant shown in Detroit. Railway lines are abandoned and left to rust. These former industrial areas earn the name brownfields for the neglected nature and blight on the landscape. But there are improvements that we observed emerge from deindustrialization as well. We see greater gender equality as both men and women move into service sector positions, with an accompanying reduction in the gender pay gap as a result. We have observed that the environment can begin to improve as factories are removed from production. Many of these former factories, these brown fields, are being retrofitted for housing or commercial uses. We see old factories become apartments, restaurants, bars, office buildings, retail establishments, you name it. We see vacant lots turned into community gardens and parks. Others now house historical museums for depicting past industrial technologies and ways of life. So when a company closes a manufacturing plant in the core, where do they decide to open a new one? Well, countries, particularly in the periphery and semi-periphery, compete to bring in manufacturing jobs. One way that countries do this is by creating special economic zones, or SEZs. A special economic zone is an area within a country that offers more favorable economic regulations, such as tax benefits or no tariffs, to attract foreign business. Corporations are offered these benefits, and in return, the country gains more jobs for its residents, more trade, and the transfer of technology and management experience. In 1975, only 29 countries had SEZs, most being industrialized countries. But since the 1980s, they have flourished in developing countries and can now be found in nearly 150 countries around the world, though estimates do vary. China has been incredibly successful with special economic zones. In 2017, Chinese special economic zones contributed more than $1 trillion to China's GDP and have created millions of jobs. But since the special economic zones are located near ports, it has created an uneven level of development between core coastal areas and peripheral interior regions in China, as well as in other developing countries. And there are a couple different types of special economic zones, which offer specific benefits typically related to trade. A free trade zone, or FTZ, is a relatively large geographic area within a country in which businesses pay few or no tariffs on goods to encourage or facilitate its role in international trade. These areas typically have warehouses and storage space, as well as strong transportation infrastructure, such as seaports, international airports, or land border crossings to facilitate easier trade. The European Union is essentially one giant free trade zone, but Hong Kong is another example. Its natural harbor and lack of tariffs have led to its success as a major port city. And there are more than 5,000 FTZs across nearly 150 countries. The last type of special economic zone that we will examine is an export processing zone, or EPZ. An export processing zone is an industrial zone with special incentives to attract foreign investment to places where goods are manufactured for re-export. Since the focus is on exports, the lack of tariffs is a primary feature of EPZs. They also tend to be significantly smaller than other special economic zones, sometimes encompassing just a single industrial park. The factories in northern Mexico called maquiladoras are good examples of export processing zones. The deindustrialization that occurred in the United States led some manufacturing jobs to relocate to Mexico, where wages are lower, there is less government oversight, and weaker or non-existent unions. They produce goods such as electronic equipment, electrical appliances, automobiles, textiles, plastics, and furniture. But where in Mexico do you think these factory owners would choose to locate? Near the border, to quickly export goods back to the United States, while also keeping transportation costs down. There are now well over 3,000 EPZs around the world, with 90% of them in Latin America and Asia. Nearly 70 million people are employed in export processing zones, with more than 50% of the workforce female. While special economic zones, including free trade zones and export processing zones, are often seen as mutually beneficial because multinational companies can pay lower wages than they would in core countries, but workers in developing countries earn a higher wage than they otherwise would, it doesn't mean that these arrangements are beneficial to everyone. Workers in core countries may have lost their jobs through deindustrialization, and workers in developing countries may work in dangerous or exploitative conditions. In addition, these new manufacturing zones can exacerbate uneven development within a country by concentrating resources and infrastructure in these special manufacturing districts to the neglect of other regions, as we saw earlier with China. But this is all part of the new international division of labor. In the late 1800s, an international division of labor was based on colonies or other countries in peripheral regions producing the raw materials and core countries manufacturing goods. Since the 1970s, though, the international division of labor has evolved as core countries begin to deindustrialize. So the new international division of labor refers to the spatial shift of manufacturing from developed countries to developing countries. Our periphery countries still have a relatively large labor force engaged in agriculture and the primary sector, but it should be noted that manufacturing that requires abundant, low-wage, low-skill labor may be transferred to periphery countries. Semi-periphery countries have seen declines in primary sector employment as more people shift to manufacturing, particularly more skilled manufacturing. For example, China specializes in the manufacturing of high-tech goods, such as flat-screen TVs and computer parts. But semi-periphery countries have also seen increases in tertiary sector jobs, including offshore jobs from core countries like call centers. Meanwhile, core countries are seeing employment increase in the tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sectors. Considering the rapid increase in the number of SEZs, EPZs, and FTZs in recent decades, it's no surprise that labor-intensive manufacturing is primarily located in low-wage periphery countries. This has created a spatial divide in terms of income that mirrors the international division of labor. The global north, which is largely engaged in the tertiary and quaternary sectors, but has just 1/4 of the world's population, controls 4/5 or 80% of the world's income. The global south, which is still engaging in primary and expanding secondary sector employment, has 3/4 of the population and just 20% of the world's income. Given the increase in outsourcing and offshoring, deindustrialization of the global core, the rise of special economic zones, free trade zones, and export processing zones, and the development of a new international division of labor, manufacturing today looks quite different than it did in your parents' or grandparents' day. So we'll conclude our lecture tonight by talking about some of the changes that have emerged due to the shifting nature of manufacturing. The days of mass producing a single uniform product are largely over. There's been a shift from Fordism, which we discussed in an earlier lecture, towards post-Fordism. Post-Fordism is the adoption by companies of flexible work rules, such as the allocation of workers to teams that perform a variety of tasks. Post-Fordism is focused on specialization. Many workers have been replaced by automated machines, as the workers that remain are part of multidisciplinary teams with different types of skills and expertise. Phone apps that are created by small independent companies are a good example, but so are global chains like Benetton and H&M. These companies churn out low-volume batches of products that can be quickly adapted for changing preferences and styles. Under the new system of post-Fordism, the importance of economies of scale decreases. Obviously, with smaller batches, the cost per unit is higher. But companies can still maximize their profits by reducing labor costs through outsourcing and offshoring. They also do not need to maintain a large inventory and can utilize just-in-time delivery. Just-in-time delivery refers to production based on customer demand. So companies will order component parts as needed and have them delivered just in time for production. The internet has made just-in-time delivery possible and an efficient way of replacing traditional manufacturing. As a result, companies do not need to pay for expensive warehouses and storage facilities for additional inventory. But just-in-time delivery does necessitate efficient logistics and transportation systems to avoid delays. But as automation has increased in manufacturing, combined with the overall trend of deindustrialization, service sector employment has expanded significantly. Over 70% of all private sector employment in the United States is classified as tertiary sector services. And services account for nearly 4 times the GDP of the secondary sector. But some manufacturing does remain in the core, especially the highly mechanized, capital-intensive manufacturing, like with high-tech industries. These include aerospace, computers, pharmaceuticals, communications, and electronics. Tons of money is invested in their development. It requires a highly skilled, well-educated workforce. High-tech firms are great examples of where economies of scale are less important, but increasing agglomeration is very important. High-tech firms take advantage of concentrations of highly skilled labor by clustering in or near large urban areas, typically with universities and well-established transportation infrastructure. So Silicon Valley is a great example of the agglomeration of high-tech industries into what is known as a growth pole. Growth poles are highly focused centers of economic activity with a high degree of agglomeration and investment and research into a particular industry. For example, biotech firms, as well as computer software and hardware development. Investment in growth poles, combined with agglomeration, can create higher multiplier effects. A multiplier effect is when a basic industry grows and indirectly creates new businesses and jobs in non-basic industries. A basic industry is an industry critical to the health of an area's economy, like automobiles in Detroit or computer firms in Silicon Valley. Non-basic industries are industries that sell their products primarily to consumers in the community. These are jobs that serve the rest of the community. Jobs like teachers and lawyers, restaurant cooks and retail associates. For example, by adding one new high-tech job, a basic industry in Silicon Valley, up to 5 additional jobs in non-basic industries can be created. So growth in a basic industry can create economic growth and job creation throughout an entire region. And we will continue to examine many of these aspects when we come back to class. Thank you for your attention tonight, and I'll see you back in class.